There is a community living along India's western coast, in the forests of Gujarat, the coastal towns of Karnataka, and scattered pockets of Andhra Pradesh and Telangana, whose members carry unmistakably African features, worship largely as Muslims in a region that is overwhelmingly Hindu, and dance to rhythms that ethnomusicologists have traced directly back to East Africa. They call themselves Siddhi, sometimes spelled Shidi or Siddhi, and their presence in India is not a secret, not a recent discovery, not a rumor requiring verification. It has been documented, discussed, and in some periods of Indian history, celebrated at the highest levels of political power. What genetics eventually added to this story wasn't proof that the Siddis are African descended. Everyone already knew that. What genetics added was a far stranger detail buried inside the timeline itself. If you're new here, this is the kind of contradiction this channel exists to dig into, and there's a fresh one waiting in the next video, so it's worth subscribing now before we get into how strange this particular timeline actually gets. The known history of the Siddis spans roughly 800 years and several distinct waves of arrival, each with its own historical texture. The earliest documented Africans arrived in India through Arab and Muslim trading networks as early as the 13th century, brought in some cases as soldiers, sailors, and administrators serving the Deccan sultanates that ruled much of central and western India before Mughal expansion. Others arrived later through Portuguese colonial trade beginning in the 16th century, transported specifically as enslaved laborers from Portuguese trading posts along the East African coast, part of the broader Indian Ocean slave trade that operated in parallel to, and largely separate from, the more widely discussed Atlantic slave trade. Still more arrived as indentured servants and mercenaries attached to various regional courts well into the 18th and 19th centuries. This wasn't a single migration event. It was a slow accumulation across roughly 6 centuries, driven by trade, warfare, and the shifting political fortunes of a dozen different regional powers. One name from this history stands out enough that any account of the Siddis has to include it. Malik Ambar, born in the Horn of Africa around 1548, was sold into slavery as a young man, eventually purchased and trained in the Deccan region, and rose from that position to become the de facto ruler of the Ahmadnagar Sultanate, commanding armies, reorganizing tax administration, and founding the city that would later become Aurangabad. For decades, Malik Ambar fought the expanding Mughal Empire to a standstill, using guerrilla tactics that Mughal chroniclers themselves grudgingly admired, delaying Mughal conquest of the Deccan by a generation. He died undefeated in battle, one of the most successful military strategists in South Asian history, and his career alone should complicate any assumption that Siddhi presence in India was simply a story of bondage. Given a history spanning 6 to 8 centuries and multiple independent waves of arrival from different points along the East African coast, brought by different powers for different purposes, you would reasonably expect the genetic record to reflect that complexity. A population built from centuries of overlapping migration should, in principle, show a genome shaped gradually, generation after generation, mixing steadily with surrounding South Asian populations, the longer each wave's descendants remained in India. That is not what population geneticists found when they finally looked closely, and the discrepancy is the real subject of this video. A landmark genome-wide study published in 2011 in the American Journal of Human Genetics, led by researchers analyzing hundreds of thousands of autosomal markers alongside mitochondrial and Y chromosome data, confirmed what history had already established. Siddhi communities in Gujarat and Karnataka carry substantial Bantu African ancestry, in the range of 65 to 70%, with most of the remainder tracing to South Asian populations and a smaller Portuguese-European component. Mitochondrial haplogroup L, a marker strongly associated with sub-Saharan African maternal lineages, appeared at 53% frequency among Gujarati Siddis and 24% among Siddis from Karnataka, confirming a direct, traceable line back to Bantu-speaking populations of southeastern Africa. None of that was surprising. Here is what was. When researchers modeled the timing of the admixture event itself, the point at which African and South Asian ancestry actually began blending within the same lineages, the data pointed to something happening within roughly the past 200 years. About 8 generations, not the 6 to 8 centuries the historical arrival record would suggest. A population whose ancestors had been arriving in India in waves since the 1200s showed a genetic mixing signature consistent with a process that only began in earnest sometime in the early 19th century. Sit with that gap for a moment, because it's the whole story. Centuries of Siddhi presence in India did not translate into centuries of genetic blending. For most of that long history, Siddhi communities appear to have remained largely endogamous, marrying within their own community rather than gradually merging into the surrounding population, despite living in the same regions, under the same rulers, for generation after generation. Whatever mixing eventually happened arrived late, compressed into a relatively narrow and recent window, long after most of the historical waves of arrival had already occurred. There is a second layer to this that makes the pattern even more specific. The gene flow researchers detected wasn't reciprocal. South Asian ancestry moved into Siddhi genomes over these past 2 centuries, but African ancestry did not move outward into neighboring Indian populations to any meaningful degree. Communities living adjacent to Siddhi settlements, sharing markets, roads, and in some regions religious institutions, show essentially no detectable African genetic signature themselves. The genetic exchange ran in one direction only, into the Siddhi population, not out of it, a pattern researchers describe as unidirectional admixture, and one that suggests something structural about how Siddhi communities were positioned socially relative to their neighbors. Whatever mixing did eventually occur was shaped by that boundary rather than dissolving it. If patterns like this fascinate you as much as they fascinate us, stick around, because the next population in this series has its own version of a boundary that never quite closed the way history said it should, and it's an even stranger case than this one. Layered onto this timing puzzle is a separate and genuinely striking finding about natural selection. Researchers examining specific genetic variants in Siddhi populations identified African-derived alleles associated with resistance to malaria, present at meaningfully elevated frequencies compared to what random inheritance alone would predict, alongside a higher prevalence of G6PD deficiency, a blood condition that, despite its complications, confers partial protection against malarial infection in regions where the disease is endemic. India's western coastal regions, including the areas Siddhi communities have historically inhabited, have long been zones of significant malarial pressure. The African-derived genetic variants that offered protection against the disease appear to have been retained and, in some analyses, actively favored by selection, even as the surrounding demographic mixing pattern stayed narrow and recent. The Siddhi genome, in other words, kept the specific pieces of its African inheritance that offered a direct survival advantage in its new environment, regardless of how socially separate the broader community remained. What emerges from putting these pieces together is a population whose history reads very differently depending on whether you're reading the historical record or the genetic one, and the disagreement between them is the actual discovery. The historical record describes a long layered story of arrival. Soldiers and administrators in the 13th century, enslaved laborers under Portuguese control from the 16th century onward, mercenaries and indentured servants into the 1800s, each wave adding to a community that, by any reasonable assumption, should show centuries of gradual blending. The genetic record describes something closer to a long period of separateness, followed by a comparatively sudden and recent onset of mixing running in one direction, alongside a very specific, biologically meaningful African genetic legacy that outlasted the social boundaries around it. It's worth comparing this timeline pattern to what geneticists have found in other African-descended populations to see how unusual it really is. Among the Garifuna of Central America, genetic mixing with the surrounding indigenous population began almost immediately after the founding shipwreck and continued steadily for generations. among the Maroons of Suriname, mixing with neighboring indigenous nations, stayed minimal for the entire 3 centuries of contact, a flat line rather than a delayed spike. The Siddis pattern doesn't match either of those shapes. It looks like a long flat line of near-total separation, followed by a distinct, relatively sudden upward bend 2 centuries ago, a graph shape that researchers still don't have a fully settled explanation for. Some have proposed that shifting religious and social dynamics in colonial-era India, changes in caste boundaries, regional political realignments, or the decline of certain patronage systems that had kept Siddis communities more insular, may have loosened the barriers that held for 600 years. Others point to the specific administrative chaos of the 18th and early 19th centuries, as Mughal authority collapsed and British colonial control expanded unevenly across the subcontinent, as a period when older social boundaries across many Indian communities, not just Siddhi ones, became more porous than they had been under more centralized rule. Neither explanation is fully proven. What's confirmed is the shape of the data itself, and the fact that it doesn't match the smooth, gradual blending story that 8 centuries of documented arrival would lead most people to expect. For Siddhi communities today, numbering somewhere between 20,000 and 60,000 people, depending on the estimate and the region counted, this genetic history sits alongside a living culture that has never needed a laboratory to confirm its African roots. Siddhi Goma, a traditional dance and drumming tradition still performed at festivals and religious gatherings, particularly around Sufi shrines associated with African saints, carries rhythmic structures. Ethnomusicologists have linked directly to East African musical traditions, transmitted and preserved across those same centuries, the genome describes as largely endogamous. The dance, in a sense, tells the same story the DNA eventually confirmed mathematically, a community that stayed distinct long enough for something specific and traceable to survive intact, rather than dissolving gradually into its surroundings, the way demographic assumptions might predict. There is a broader lesson embedded in the specific shape of this timeline gap, one this channel keeps encountering in different forms across different populations. Arrival and integration are not the same process, and they don't necessarily move at the same speed. A community can be present in a place, documented, acknowledged, even politically powerful through figures like Malik Ambar, for centuries, while remaining genetically and socially distinct from its neighbors the entire time, only beginning to blend biologically long after its historical presence was already an established fact. The Siddis didn't take 800 years to become part of India's genetic landscape because integration was slow. They took 200 years to begin blending because, for 600 years before that, whatever kept them a defined community held, right up until, for reasons the historical record doesn't fully explain, it started to give way. The genome remembers exactly when that boundary began to soften. It just isn't the number history would have guessed, and it's the kind of gap between record and biology this channel will keep chasing, as long as there are populations willing to let their DNA finally answer a question their own history left open.